Today we are talking about Set. Now while Set is technically not released on the live client so far, I spent a lot of time toying around with him on PTS, testing him in games versus other players, testing him a lot in jungle practice, and crunching a lot of numbers surrounding him. And I want to talk about my conclusions out of that so far. There is one disclaimer that I have to make, and that is that everything was tested on PTS settings, meaning I had 200 plus ping the whole time, so some things may not feel quite the same on live client. The conversation here is not so much if Set will be under or overpowered, because that's really hard to determine based on the information that we have and on the tools that we're provided with on PTS. What it will be about is how his kit merges together, how everything functions, and what may be weak points of the kit and lack of synergy, for example, and how that could all work out in the end and what possible solution to that could be. Another reason for this is that I think parts of Set's kit are very overpowered and others are very underpowered right now, and that kind of makes it harder to find an overall balance spot for him, because really, if one ability is super strong but another super weak, the guard itself may not be balanced even though the result is balanced. Without further ado, let's jump into his kit. His passive is Relentless and it gives him 2.5% attack speed per stack. Every time he damages an enemy, he gains a stack. This can be damage from abilities or from basic attacks. These stacks last 3 seconds and restack, and also the maximum here is 10 stacks, so maximum of 25% extra attack speed. The interesting thing here is that this doesn't stack through items like Crusher, for example, or Mystical Mail, which I think is a little bit unfortunate actually. I can see why it doesn't work for certain items, but especially Crusher would have been a cool interaction here to amplify him, but at the same time it would have made Crusher very core. The passive can be uncapped by using your ultimate. I think overall the passive itself is a solid passive. It doesn't need all too much discussion surrounding it. The discussion here will be more when we look at the abilities in connection at the end. On its own, it's a reasonable passive, an interesting one, though it feels a little bit counterintuitive that the attack speed goes up. It would, in my opinion, almost be better if it goes down, so you have fast hits at the start and then they slow down, because in most situations, if you don't have a lot of attack speed to begin with, you're probably not even going to hit an enemy 10 times. This is unless you, of course, stack this on minions first. So while it's a decent passive, it's not a strong passive in my opinion. His first ability is Skewer. Now Skewer is interesting in many regards. Skewer itself is a line ability that deals 230 damage plus 80% scaling. But if you have any spawns, we'll get to that in the second ability, the spawns will also deal damage. One spawn hitting deals 180 base damage and 80% scaling, and every spawn after that will deal 40% of that damage. The ability also slows for 3 seconds by 25%. What's very interesting to keep in mind here is that the cooldown is 7 seconds. That means if you proc this once, you can basically almost keep a consistent slow on the enemy if you have a little bit of cooldown reduction. And that seems to be the main synergy with the rest of his kit outside of the obvious use of the minions from the second ability. You have a slow that allows you to use further basic attacks on the target, and I think that's where the logic here comes in, and this is something that maybe allows him to go into other attack speed items like Atalanta's Bow over Hasten Katana and get some more stats out of that. He does have some weird delay on this ability. The minions seem to sometimes not attack at the same time as the projectile flies out. They rather wait a little bit and dash after, and this gets worse with ping. So this may be less of an issue on the normal client at the end. The projectile speed also feels a little bit slower than many other projectiles. I'm not quite sure if that's just the looks of it or if this is actually a factual thing. The control of the minions in the ability is very limited. You can control the direction they're going in, they're charging in, but as you can't control the distance, and they will always cover the same distance, it's kind of iffy in that regard, because it would be the ability that allows you to push the minions around, but most of the time you just want to push the minions into the enemy and then they dash however further the range after that is. The scaling of the ability with one minion is already 160%, which is pretty insane on such a short cooldown, and that in itself basically makes him a primary choice for an ability-based build with a lot of power and a lot of cooldown reduction, based on the skewer. His second ability is Spawn of Set. Spawn of Set has 2 charges, and each of them is a spawn that Set can summon, and this spawn will then stand in place and have an attack range of 12 feet, so normal basic attack range, in which they will attack anything that comes too close. The damage here is 20 plus 25% of your physical power, so a little bit of scaling, and the duration scales up from 8 to 12 seconds with the ranks, while the cooldown scales down from 13 to 11 seconds. The ability has a mana cost of 30. You can summon these spawns behind walls, but the unfortunate thing is that you can't see them if you do that. They do give you vision, but also not really. It seems they just reveal enemy guards, but not jungle camps, for example, which is a bit strange. I don't know how exactly this works. And what you can do is you can teleport through them with your third ability through the wall. And when you do that, you can actually use your target. It will highlight them in places where you can teleport, so you can see that they're there. And that will show you where exactly the spawn is, but they're not visible otherwise, and I think they should be. The minion range is, in my opinion, extremely short. In many situations, they will just stand right next to a wave and not attack them. They don't really seem to have a target prioritization. I'm not quite sure, but it seemed that if I put them where multiple minions and a guard are, they just attack whatever they feel like. That may just have been a misconception. Maybe the guard just was too far away at all times, but I could never really notice them prioritizing guards. What I find really weird about this ability is that it has a mana cost tied to it of 30, meaning if you spawn both of your spawns, it's actually 60 mana down, which is, well, a full-on ability essentially. That is strange because these act like standing pets and they really don't do that much on their own, and they're somewhat required for other abilities to work effectively. So you're burning a lot of mana here, and I don't understand why. Skadi's 2, for example, which also utilizes a pet, it doesn't require any mana. An ability like Pele 3, which is also very utility focused and not a core damaging part of a kit itself, costs 10 mana. And even King Arthur's 1, an ability that does full on damage in multiple stances even, costs 35 mana. So literally just 5 more for an ability that does way more. I'm of the opinion that the Spawn of Set should have a mana cost of 10 at best or less. I really don't see the reason for Spawn of Set costing so much, because it basically forces you into Transcendence as long as you want to go for a playstyle where you use the spawns a lot, and as the guard kind of revolves around using these spawns a lot, I don't see how else you're going to do it. As much as they're required in their current state and with their current damage, the mana cost is simply not warranted at all. Set's third ability is Sandstorm. This ability lasts for 6 seconds and does damage to enemies around Set every 0.4 seconds. This also gives him 15% physical damage reduction and allows him to teleport to one of his spawns by using the ability again. Also, it has a blind on the ability, so enemies that are close get a little bit of a blind on them, but it's a very minimal blind that will not affect you all too much. The teleport range is 65 units. The AoE damaging range is not described here, but as far as I was able to find out in jungle practice, it should be around 17.5 units in a radius around Set. So, what can we say about this? If you use this ability without teleporting first, you can actually proc Hydra's Lament twice, once by using it and then once after teleporting. The problem is that it's almost impossible to do that in a fight. Okay, maybe not impossible, but extremely annoying, because you spawn a minion nearby to attack the enemy guard, and then you want to use the 3 and you have to move the target all the way away from the enemy basically to use the 3 without proccing the teleport on the minion. Because if you do, not only do you burn your teleport, but you also burn the possibility to double proc Hydra's Lament, and I think this is absolutely counterintuitive, and it would be better if the teleport worked by double tapping the ability and not just once. But the problem is that that would mean that you need to press a total of 3 buttons to actually get the teleport going, so it would effectively delay the teleport more, which also wouldn't be good. So no matter how you put this, it's gonna be a downside, and I will propose a solution later in this video. Then the 15% physical damage reduction is nice and it makes sense, but I'm not quite sure why it's just physical. That part just doesn't have any logic to me personally. Maybe he's supposed to box physicals better, but why? Then a very interesting part to me is also the damage of this ability. It's 8 to 24 depending on the rank, plus 7% scaling every 0.4 seconds for 6 seconds. Now typically comparing abilities to abilities of other gods is somewhat misleading, but I think we can make an exception here, because we have cooldown, who actually has way more damaging abilities than Set, so he should have an AoE that's on the weaker side in comparison, because for cooldown the AoE is basically just a mana burner, so to speak, or a rage burner rather, and it just added nice damage, and it will also last for 6 seconds, but tick every 0.5 seconds. So they have the same amount of damage, and we can calculate what amount of damage they do over 2 seconds. And Set's 3 will do 40 damage on the lowest rank over 2 seconds, or 120 base damage on the highest rank. And he will do that with 35% physical power scaling. This ability has a radius of roughly 17.5 units. And then we have cooldown, also starting at 40 base damage and also going up to 120 over 2 seconds. Difference here is 20% scaling instead of 35% scaling. But cooldown's ability also has a radius of 22.5 units, and 5 units in a radius make a massive difference for how often you will hit enemies, and in my opinion more than offset the scaling. Of course, the abilities have some other perks, and especially in the case of Set has some extra benefits here that allow him to blind enemies a little bit and give him also a slow immunity, I haven't mentioned that yet, as well as the teleport tools as well. But still, it feels somewhat weird to me where a god only has 2 actual directly damaging abilities that don't depend on, the particular range where the enemy has to run by the clone to actually get their damage off. And then one of them is actually somewhat low damage in comparison and a relatively small radius as well. So not really, in my opinion, even worth leveling in many situations over the cooldown reduction on the 2 and the duration of the 2, as that will give you more damage for the 1. And that just so heavily sways him towards his 1, especially since you will need the 3 for escaping relatively often as well. So you can't just focus on leveling that and just using it for damage, because then you never get out of anything. So I don't really quite understand the idea here of making one ability extremely strong in terms of scaling and in terms of cooldown, and then making the other one very weak in terms of damage output, and just more of a utility thing overall. But before I start ranting here, let's look at the ultimate. The ultimate is Kingslayer, and that's got a lot of different interactions as well. Set gets enraged and puts a mark on enemies. So when he hits them with the basic attack, they get 1 mark, and after 4 hits, this mark explodes and it deals damage to them, and it heals Set, and at the same time Set gets 25% extra movement speed, and he is also unlocking his passive so he can get infinite attack speed, assuming that he hits an enemy an infinite amount of times, or it stacks at up to 100 stacks, so you can realistically not really get it in a game. And then this also charges your 2 every time you pop this mark. You get another spawn, and if the spawn is like overfilling your inventory of spawns, so to speak, your stacks that you already have, then it'll just spawn the spawn immediately. So you basically have to drop those spawns mid-fight if you want to position them properly. And the ability has a duration of 12 seconds, so very long, with a 90 seconds cooldown. So there's a lot going on here. Let's start from the beginning. The visuals of this ability are very cool, but using it feels relatively unspectacular unless you have a very high amount of attack speed, because really just pop in this passive on an enemy sometimes. And this may also be because I think the values are a little off. The extra damage is 25 to 85 plus 25% of your physical power scaling. That seems like very low scaling, just 25% extra on every 4th hit, and then a little bit of base damage. It doesn't seem like much to me at all, especially late game if you're going against crit guards or whatever. And I don't really know why it's that low. Maybe if you were to go full attack speed, you would otherwise abuse this a little bit, but even then I don't see it as a problematic value in terms of how high it is. But what's even weirder to me is the second part here being the heal. The heal starts at 30 and goes up to 90 with 20% scaling. And keep in mind, this only works against guards. You can't do this on minions. I don't know where these values came from, but a 90 heal in late game from your ultimate on every 4 hits, it's not very much. Again, if you have super high attack speed, okay, yes, it gets a bit more benefit, but I don't see why this doesn't have more scaling. So that if you invest heavily into attack speed, you get more healing that way, but if you invest heavily into power, then you get more healing that way. Which in my opinion would be absolutely fair, because that would open up the ultimate to multiple build paths as well. You know, if it had, whatever, 70% scaling, it would be a whole different story. And to put this in perspective a little bit, I want to use another healing basic attack guard here, and that is Bellona. Bellona also heals on every 4th hit during her 3. And she actually gets an extended basic attack range while she uses this, and she can use this as long as she wants, as long as she stays in combat somehow, and it works against minions as well. And her healing starts at 30 as well. It only scales up to 50 instead of 90, and it doesn't have power scaling, so it can't go quite as high, but considering that it's far from an ultimate, it just seems like the better choice. And I mean, the 3 also comes with extra damage outside of that, and it comes with a disarm, so it's not like that's all the ability has. So that makes this ult feel strangely underwhelming, and I especially had that feeling when going up against the Kali, who has a lot of things going on in her ultimate. One of the good things about this ult is the movement speed increase, making it a lot easier to stick to enemies, and I think that is good. I also don't really understand the 12-second duration. Most fights don't really last 12 seconds, and realistically, I don't think you're gonna benefit from it for such a long time in most situations you're in. I guess maybe if you're hunting someone down, but outside of that, I'm not quite sure. And then do you really want to burn your ultimate just to run after someone? It's a bit weird in how it's set up here, and it feels a bit not tied together yet. And that, I think, is a general impression that I have with Set's kit overall. The kit generally lacks control. You really only have a slow and a super weak blind, and it doesn't really fit together and therefore feels somewhat disconnected. And I also want to show you some other numbers in this regard. And this is the level 20 base stats of various assassins. I just randomly picked a lot of them. And on the left side we have set stats, and whenever a stat is highlighted, it's actually lower than set stats, and otherwise it's higher or sometimes the same. So what you can see here is that Set is on the lower end of health for all assassins. The 3 exceptions that exist here are Ratatoskr, Najah, and Mercury. 2 of them have self-heals that offset that already, and 2 of them have extremely high mobility as well. And then in Najah's case, he's also spending extended periods of the fight not being hittable, either through being in the air or through his immunity frames. So these guys have very good reasons to have a little less health. Keep in mind, for Set, the only sustain is in his ultimate, and it's not even that good. In terms of mana, he's also on the lower end, with only Kali and Najah being slightly lower. With Kali, I can kind of see she's just not a mana heavy god in general. She's a lot more about her basic attacks. When Najah's mana is so low is something I cannot explain. In terms of movement speed, Set's somewhere in the middle, so that's at least solid. And in terms of range, he's there with almost every other assassin. He doesn't have any other benefits like AoE or something either though. And then what I find very interesting is the attack speed. Out of the assassins I picked here, there's actually just one that has lower attack speed than Set, which is Bakasura, the 1.32, and I think he just has lower because he can get more through his kits relatively frequently, and it might be a bit overwhelming. The Set can get a little bit too, but for him, having a little bit more attack speed would go a long way in terms of the benefits that he gets from his passive and in terms of even stacking his passive in the first place. And I don't understand why he's not at the top end of attack speed. We can see that Mercury has 0.1 attack speed more than Set, which is really a lot, especially when it comes to itemization and everything as well. So I don't see why a hybrid Set that is so reliant on having decent attack speed but also decent power does not get more of that. terms of power, he's in the middle of the field, but the power values here also just differ by 3. So it's not really of importance in comparison to the rest of the stuff. Same with the physical protection. They're almost in the same spot here, all of them between 69 and 73 or 74, I think. So it's very, very indifferent. So there's not really any category where Set shines. He's a little bit towards the upper end when it comes to MP5 maybe, and his HP5 is also okay. But then again, the differences here between the different characters are incredibly low as well. And for comparison's sake, I also showed his level 1 stats with some gods here, and you can see his base HP is not terrible. He's a bit higher than some of the others here, but still not quite as high as the hybrid bruisers like Willish. And he also isn't super high above Red Tusker, for example. It's just less than 20 HP difference. He also is low on mana at the start of the game, which is, again, relatively bad for a character that is so dependent on spamming a lot of abilities. And with everything else, he kind of stays in the middle field, essentially, along with the others, because his stats don't differ that much. Point is that he doesn't really have a single stat where he stands out to a degree where it'd be like, yes, this is Set's niche. And I think this should be attack speed. I think he should have more attack speed so that he can build more into power and not lose out on too much, and then scale higher from everything that he builds in terms of attack speed as well. And the fact that he has an attack speed increase can't really be an argument against that here either, because Mercury's attack speed increase is definitely better. And that brings us to the general dilemma that we have with Set's kit. On one hand, you want to have more attack speed for the ultimate specifically, so that you can get more spawns. And you want to get more spawns so that you can deal more damage with your 1, because they will all deal extra damage. But in order to deal more damage with the spawns, you want to have more power. And you also want to be able to use the 1 very, very frequently, so you want to have cooldown reduction. And outside of the AAs on the ultimate and the passive, you're also pretty much an ability-based character for the most part that revolves around this 1 ability. In that regard, you want to build a full-on ability CDR build, but then you also don't want to do that because you make your passive and your ultimate close to useless in comparison to how good they could be. So whatever decision you make, you're completely going into opposite path. And you could, for example, go crit as well, which would be interesting because he is, in my opinion, the first god who can make really good use of Malice, as the cooldown reduction for his 1 is then almost close to 30%. And that is a very nice perk here, because you can then build AA and Malice and get the cooldown reduction for the 1, but still, then you'll be lacking in other departments as well. There are hybrid items that can facilitate all of this, but I don't think there's any build that can fit in everything you need. Every time I try to think of a good build, I ended up at some point realizing that I'm out of item slots for something that I would have needed. I will need some percentage pen at some point in most games. I will need a Magi's Blessing, especially with this guy, because he doesn't have any CC immunity outside of slow immunity. And then the rest of the damaging items just don't seem enough. Like, I would love to run Crusher, Atalantis, and Silver Branch, for example, along with Boots and then Magi's and Exos, Titan's Bane. But if I do that, I cannot possibly fit in any CDR, or I cannot fit in Malice. So I have to swap out one of them, and then I make sacrifices in another department already. It's just too hybrid and too unfocused, in my opinion. You also have the hypothetical potential to use Hydra's Lament in various regards, because he can multi-proc it on almost everything. Every use of the 2 gives you a proc for Hydra's Lament. You can proc it 2 times on the 3, and you can proc it on the 1 as well. But there's not even enough room for Hydras and decent items in most builds that he can run. So whatever you do, and you also want to counter build sometimes. You want to, for example, build anti-heal, and if you do that, it becomes even more complicated. And then you have the hypothetical inclusion of Crusher. And Crusher is very nice because it has the attack speed and the pen and everything, but at the same time he's horrible at utilizing the procs of the Crusher compared to other gods. He can proc it on the 1 and he can proc it on the 3 once, because the 2 is pets. They don't proc Crusher. I haven't actually tested if it works on the ultimate, but even if it does, it's still something that requires you to use 4 basics in the first place. Again, it just makes it weird. And technically he would have a very good fit for a bruiser build as well, with his protection reduction, everything, but then how do you fit in all the items that you need? How do you fit in the attack speed, basically, that you want to have? And I guess maybe you can fit CDR and Bruiser together, but then you're probably lacking the power to do much with your one, and you end up in the same situation because his base damage isn't that high. As I already said, he also lacks CC immunity, which most assassins need, and especially a super aggressive assassin like his playstyle, where you often will use your only escape to engage, will need something to survive a lot of the onslaught, and otherwise he'll always stick to Magi's. At the same time, he lacks the immobility that an assassin would require in mitigations, as long as you go for an aggressive kit usage, because this is kind of this scenario that we had with Daji, but more extreme, because he doesn't just teleport in and does his damage, but he also has really nothing to get out. He has got his ultimate with a little bit of extra movement speed, but the moment he teleports in with a 3, he sacrifices his teleport, it's not his mobility in that regard, and he sacrifices his slow immunity. Daji, on the other hand, still has a decent degree of mobility in her 2 afterwards, even though she can be stopped with that, and she has the ultimate to jump away in another way and get out of combat. And then you also have not much CC in the kit yourself. You don't have any hard CC. One solution to that has been proposed quite often is that if he hits more than one spawn on the enemy with his one, that the one would stun. Somebody else proposed that the minions, the spawns, should slow a little bit as well, or maybe apply a stacking slow or something. There are some possibilities here. I wanted to throw them out. And another one that I wanted to throw out in terms of what could be done for the teleport is moving the teleport to the 2. How exactly that would work with the charges of the 2 and the cooldown of the 2 is something that would have to be figured out. For example, it could be that the charges are only visible in the passive and the cooldown for the teleport is visible in the 2 itself, or that you can use a charge to teleport and then can only spawn one minion. But I think this would be a much better solution overall to how his teleport works. Because if the teleport is on the 2, you could make it so that if you place it in an empty area, it will spawn a minion, but if you target an already existing spawn, then you will just teleport there. And that would free up the 3, which is super bloated at the moment in terms of what it all does at the same time. It would disconnect your slow immunity and your escape. It would disconnect the damaging part and your escape, so you can use your damage more freely in a fight. And it would still allow you to very quickly use your teleport as well, because you just press the same button twice if you haven't used a spawn in that moment. And it would overall, I think, make the kit feel a lot more polished, and it would also allow you to use your Hydra's procs more effectively. Yet another thought that I had is that his kit would synergize a lot better overall if his one did not scale with power, but the damage of it instead scaled with attack speed. Because if that was the case, then it would make a lot more sense for Set to just invest into attack speed outright and overall be useful that way. And it would be a very new, interesting path. It would be a god that's focused on attack speed and cooldown reduction in the same way. And I would really like that, but right now, that's just not what it is. And as it stands right now, and from what we've seen so far, it seems that just focusing on ability damage and focusing on the one and ignoring half his kit seems to be the better way, which I think is almost depressing. The only thing that Set really has going at this point is the burst with the 1 and extreme chase potential through the slow and through the extra movement speed that he gets, and the teleport, which is very, very strong. But outside of that, I would still say he feels strange, and I hope that Horus takes another look at how he works right now and maybe figures if the propositions that I made here are something that could be useful, or if there's other options that could somehow improve the feel of the character. With that, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. Got a lot longer than planned, and I put in a lot more info than I originally planned to, but hey, at least this makes up for not having a video yesterday when this was originally meant to come out. If you're new to the channel, feel free to click the sub button and the bell, it really helps me out. And other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow or the day after. DukeSloth, out.